Hello and welcome to the 37th talk in the NOAA Environmental Leadership Seminar series, or NELS. The goal of these seminars is to share examples of NOAA's leading role in environmental science by those who lead it and make it happen. I am Hernan Garcia with NOAA Nestes, and I will be your host today. I would like to thank the NOAA Science Council for sponsoring these webinars, and the NELS team who I work with to plan and execute these webinars. Kathy Poser is the outreach librarian at the NOAA Central Library with NOAA OER, Sandra Clark, business analyst with NOAA Nestes Star, and Robert Levy, the NOAA Studio production manager. Let me provide some seminar logistics. All the online attendees are muted. You may post your questions in the Adobe Connect Q&A box at any time, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end. To access closed captions, please click on the closed caption button at the top of the Adobe Connect screen. And also, this seminar is being recorded for later viewing. We thank our captioner today, Tracy Steele. As a matter of introduction, parts of NOAA, or what NOAA is today, can be traced back to the 1800s, such as the Survey of the Coast in 1807, established by then U.S. President Thomas Jefferson. Following in that tradition is today's speaker, Admiral Benjamin Evans. He is the director of NOAA's Office of Coast Survey and responsible for overseeing mapping and charting all U.S. coastal waters, as well as representing the U.S. in international hydrographic activities. Admiral Evans has served as commanding officer of NOAA ships, as well as in many other leadership capacities across NOAA. Thank you so much, Admiral, for presenting today. The mic is yours.
Well, thank you, Hernan, and I'm excited to be here today to share with you all some of the history of Coast Survey, but really how we've evolved over our 216-year history from an organization that's been focused on a specific product, nautical charts, to one which is a world leader in navigation products and services, and also serves a much broader demand for geospatial data in our oceans. And while I'm laying that out, I'll also talk a little bit about my role in this organization and the path that led me to the role of director almost 2 years ago. But before I start into that, I know we have a number of folks joining us from outside of the agency, and maybe wondering to themselves, wait a second, I thought NOAA was a civilian agency. What's up with the uniform and the rank? And it's true, NOAA is a large civilian agency, but it has the advantage of a small uniform component, the NOAA Commission Corps. There's a long and interesting history about how NOAA came to have its own uniform service, and that's probably worth its own seminar at another time. But I'll simply say that today the NOAA Corps is a critical element of NOAA's overall workforce. We're an operational science agency, and the NOAA Corps leads the missions which require a mix of operational skill, technical expertise, flexibility, and adaptability. Most of the NOAA Corps serves in NOAA's Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, which operates our fleet of ships and aircraft. But NOAA Corps officers serve throughout NOAA, as well as with the Navy and the Coast Guard, and in my own office here in Coast Survey. So with that out of the way, we'll get back to the topic of today's conversation, which is Coast Survey. So as Hernan mentioned, the Survey of the Coast was established by President Jefferson in 1807. And we are the modern descendant of that action. And as such, we believe we are the oldest scientific agency in the federal government. Now, President Jefferson recognized that the United States was an inherently maritime nation. We were dependent on reliable maritime transportation for our economic survival, and we were dependent on the sea for our defense from adversaries. And all of this demanded accurate charts of our coasts, ports, and waterways. So while the Survey of the Coast was established in 1807, the first nautical chart wasn't published until 1839, and that was of Newark Bay in New York Harbor. And over the time since then, our agency evolved from the Survey of the Coast into the Coast and Geodetic Survey, which was ultimately one of the primary components that was incorporated into NOAA when NOAA was established in 1970. But just as we were in 1807, we remain the nation's chart maker. We're responsible for surveying and charting the territorial sea and exclusive economic zone of the United States. Now, hydrography has continuously evolved over this time, but the pace of change is now rapidly accelerating. And I'll go into some of those milestones in more detail in later slides, but the big takeaway is that for the first 100 years or so of our history, hydrographers used the same basic survey methods of lead lines and visual means of positioning that they had for centuries before. And then in the 20th century, electronics simultaneously revolutionized hydrography and navigation with sonar and electronic positioning. And in the last 30 years or so, we have driven even more significant advancements in technology that allowed us to collect higher resolution data to build complete models of the seafloor. So what do we mean by lead line surveying? It is quite literally a lump of lead on the end of a carefully calibrated rope or wire, manually lowered to the seabed by a surveyor, as shown on the left. The positions of these depth measurements were carefully computed by measuring angles to a network of fixed known positions ashore by a process known as triangulation, and that's shown on the right. This could be quite accurate, but it's laborious and leads to a sparse data set. A full day of work might produce only a few hundred measurements. Now, because the work took so long, hydrographers collected only the data necessary to support the end product of their work, which was a paper nautical chart. The level of detail the hydrographers collected in the field was directly tied to the scale of the chart that was planned for the area. And you can see by the survey smooth sheet on the left, which shows soundings acquired in neat rows. In this instance, it's actually probably from single beam sonar rather than lead line, but the principle still holds. And this shows an area in Whale Passage in Alaska from 1971. The spacing of those survey lines and the density of the soundings along those lines was selected to sample the area adequately to support the chart. A large-scale, small area, high-resolution chart would require a high-resolution survey. But if a small-scale chart covering a large area was planned, the resolution of the survey could be much less. Now, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but compare the 1971 survey on the left to the modern survey of the same area shown on the right, which was performed just a few years ago with multi-beam sonar, and I'll talk more about that later. But these sonars produce a continuous three-dimensional model of the seabed composed of millions of measurements instead of hundreds of discrete sparse soundings. And with this modern equipment, the resolution of our surveying is no longer driven by the detail we need to support the chart. We collect the data at the highest resolution the surveying systems can support, which allows us to not only produce charts and navigation products, but support a wide range of other uses. Now, a little bit more detail on the evolution of depth measurement methods. Lead line, as I've mentioned, was the usual survey method until really about the mid-1920s. It was accurate, but sparse and laborious, and it could miss significant features that fell between measurements. And in the 1920s and 30s, the Coast and Geodetic Survey began the use of acoustic sounding systems. This was at the advent of single beam sonar, which measured the depth directly beneath the survey vessel. So instead of manually measuring individual soundings, hydrographers could quickly collect the line of continuous depth measurements. But there was still no information between the survey lines, as you can see in the middle plot of this slide. And at the same time, electronic positioning methods began to develop that did not rely on visual methods. And technology continued to advance with further improvements in positioning methods and new sonar systems. Now, I haven't shown it here, but side-scan sonar was a significant advancement which produced an image of the seabed and was used starting in the 1970s. But the really big advancements happened in the 1990s with the advent of the Global Positioning System for public use and the first commercially available multi-beam echo sounders. Now, as I mentioned, multi-beam sonar allows the hydrographer to measure the depths across a wide swath of the seafloor. It eliminates the gaps between sounding lines, as shown on the right, and produces a continuous three-dimensional model of the seafloor. Multi-beam and GPS were really game changers and accelerated the pace of surveying and produced dramatically more widely useful products. Just to drive that last point home, take a look at the image on the right. This is a digital elevation model constructed from a multi-beam sonar survey of the braided channels at the mouth of the Nushagak River in Alaska. Millions and millions of individual soundings were collected to produce this model, allowing us to resolve features as small as half a meter. And also, by analyzing the strength of the sonar return, we can estimate the composition of the seafloor. And I'll talk more about that later. But this begins to give you an idea of the value of these data. Sure, we can produce a much more accurate and complete nautical chart, which allows mariners to operate more safely and make fuller use of the available water. But imagine if you're interested in understanding the critical salmon runs in this river. What paths will the fish take? Where will they find good spawning areas? Or what if you're interested in forecasting water levels and currents and floods? Where and how fast will the freshwater flow downstream? How will it interact with the incoming tides from the ocean? What will the impacts on the communities be along this river? Data sets like this can help answer these questions in the ways that traditional hydrographic surveys could not. But let's go back to that primary navigation product, the nautical chart, for a moment. Because after all, by law, that is why we exist. And it is not only surveying, but our products as well that are in the midst of an ongoing digital revolution. On the left, you see an image of the paper chart of the mouth of the Nushagak, the same area that we were looking at on the last slide. This is the product that Coast Survey has been producing for the entirety of our 216-year history. These are aesthetically pleasing and highly functional, and a mariner from 1807 would be able to use this product immediately. But it is a printed paper static product, and the process of producing and updating paper nautical charts is arduous, and the only information you can convey to the mariner is that which can be printed on the paper. So in the 1990s, the International Hydrographic Community developed standards for an electronic navigational chart, or ENC, to be used in a new class of navigation systems called Electronic Chart Display and Information Systems, or ECDIS. NOAA began producing its first ENCs in the early 2000s, and we introduced them in our fleet later that decade. You can see the ENC for the mouth of the Nushagak at right. And printed out like this, it's certainly not as pretty as the paper chart, but it is rich in detail that the paper cannot provide. And when used in an ECDIS, or a chart plotter, the mariner can customize their view to highlight information that is of greatest importance to their particular needs. And for us in Coast Survey, these ENCs are more efficient to produce, easier to update, and simpler to distribute. This is why we're in the midst of a challenging transition from producing both paper and electronic charts to supporting solely ENCs. And by the end of 2025, we will have canceled all of our traditional paper charts. I'll go into more detail on why we are maintaining only electronic charts later in the presentation, but I'd like to pause here in the timeline because it's about 25 years ago when I joined Coast Survey and became part of this story. Before I jump into talk about my path through Coast Survey and NOAA, I'd like to provide a little bit more background on Coast Survey's organization. And I promise you there are no org charts in this presentation, but in broad terms, Coast Survey is organized into 4 complementary divisions. And I'll start with the Coast Survey Development Lab, which is portrayed in the upper right, because it starts here. This is where we develop and test the hardware and software that allows us to do our work in the field. And CSDL also has a critical role on the back end because our marine modeling capability resides there. These are the folks that take that high resolution bathymetry we collect, as well as other data, and build and test the computer models that allow NOAA to forecast water levels, currents, and other oceanographic parameters. We also have our Hydrographic Surveys division in the upper left, and this is really our data division. They're responsible for writing the specifications and planning our hydrographic surveys. They monitor the completion of the work, whether it's done in-house by the NOAA fleet or by contractors, and then they assess the quality of the finished product. The data then flows to our Marine Chart division, shown in the lower left. This is our largest division, which is our center of expertise in nautical cartography. And these are the folks who take HSD's hydrographic surveys, combine that with other data from a wide range of sources, and build and distribute the nautical charts. And last, but certainly not least, our Navigation Services division. And in many respects, this is our most critical division because they are responsible for engaging with our stakeholders to understand our customers' requirements. The key capabilities we use for this are a nationwide network of stakeholder engagement specialists called navigation managers, and our navigation response teams, which are responsible for performing near-shore surveys in response to stakeholder requests. Most recently, after Hurricane Idalia in Florida, the Coast Guard requested the local navigation response team to resurvey the affected ports and waterways to find debris from the storm, which can impact safe navigation. In addition to our divisions, we have several other programs, including our Integrated Ocean and Coastal Mapping Program, which coordinates mapping efforts across the federal government and with non-federal partners to fulfill the slogan, map once, use many times, as well as our Joint Hydrographic Center, which is one of our academic research and education centers where many of the enabling technologies that are in use worldwide in hydrography today were first developed. And this is also where many of our most accomplished hydrographers were trained. So that's an introduction to the organization, but where do I fit into this? I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself, but I've been fortunate to have a front row seat in the transformation of our field over the last 20 plus years. So I'll share a bit of what I've seen. I grew up in upstate New York, where I spent a lot of time sailing on Lake Ontario. And I was always interested in navigation and charts, but I never stopped to think about it as a career. But I always thought that always imagined I'd end up doing something related to the water. So after majoring in physics as an undergrad, I went on to grad school in ocean engineering, where my research focused on acoustics and navigation systems for autonomous underwater vehicles. I joined the NOAA Corps and the Coast Survey in 2000, early in this transformative period that I've been describing. I reported to the NOAA ship Rudy for my first assignment in the early days of multi-beam echo sounders. Not all the survey vessels in the NOAA fleet had multi-beam at that time. And the system we had on Rudy would be considered rudimentary by today's standards. It was only capable of low resolution bathymetry. And we actually dove, we did a lot of scuba diving to dive on every target that we found with the multi-beam to confirm the depth. But in spite of this, Rudy was considered one of the most technologically advanced ships in the fleet at the time. And from the Rudy, I went on to a shore assignment in Seattle, working in the Coast Survey Development Laboratory. And one of my duties at CSDL was picking up where my graduate research had left off, working on the first test and evaluation of uncrewed systems for NOAA hydrography, and which now, 20 years later, are an increasingly essential tool in our toolbox. After CSDL, I went on to be the NOAA ship, the operations officer on NOAA ship Rainier, home ported at that point in Seattle. And really, in many respects, this was the dream assignment for any hydrographer, because instead of resurveying areas that had been previously charted with older technology, as I had done on Rudy on the East Coast, we were working primarily in Alaska, where we were assigned large areas where the chart was simply white, no data at all. So here's an example from that time, and I hope you guys can see it on the screen. This slide shows the chart of an area of Southwest Alaska, which includes Kuyukta Bay and Mitrofania Island. And I'm going to try to turn on my pointer to point those areas out. So this is Kuyukta Bay here. This is Mitrofania Island. This is Mitrofania Bay up in this area. Oh, it doesn't look like it's quite keeping up. Okay. I guess, do I need to click and drag? Yeah, that's what I need to do. So here's Kuyukta Bay. Sorry about that. And here's Mitrofania Bay and Mitrofania Island. And as you can see, this is just big swaths of white on the chart. And we were assigned to go fill that in. I remember when we steamed into Kuyukta Bay on the first day, and we had all the ship's survey launches arrayed in front of the ship because we didn't know what was there. We didn't know if there was a rock pinnacle that might stick up, and we needed to survey that on the way in to keep the ship safe. And then we went to establish a tide gauge, somewhere right around up in here, as I recall. And we found that our selected location for that tide gauge had also been selected by a family of bears that had absolutely no fear of humans whatsoever. So we went someplace else. And I could fill the rest of the time with sea stories, including the time that I caught a 200-pound halibut right about there and spent the whole night cleaning that fish and packing it in the freezer. But really what I want to talk about here is what the chart looked like when we were done. So if we transition to that, we can see that all that space that was white, after we completed those surveys, now we have data which covers that area completely. And the main point here is that the Coast Survey continued to transform our survey and processes during this time as we continued to move away from manual techniques. For instance, the resolution of our sonar systems on this survey in Alaska had quadrupled since my first assignment on Rudy. So we were much more confident in the depths of the features we found, and scuba diving became less critical to our work. But this massive increase in data volume demanded automated methods for processing and assessing the data efficiently, which led to the introduction of bathymetric products that were not composed of direct measurements, but were instead models of the seafloor, computed from multiple soundings and their estimated uncertainties in each position. You can imagine that this transition to models and uncertainties was difficult for an organization that had spent the last 200 years directly measuring every depth on the chart. Now, after Rainier, I stepped away from Coast Survey and had the amazing opportunity to work for the NOAA administrator in the Program Coordination Office. This couldn't have been more different than the technical operational work that I had focused on for the first portion of my career. PCO was a great place to begin to understand how big NOAA really works, and I was exposed to the work of other NOAA programs and began to see the demand and potential value of Coast Survey's work beyond navigation. But I also saw that our work was not well known outside our community in the National Ocean Service. So after PCO, I dove back into Coast Survey with valuable new perspective. And my next major assignment was as Planconing Commanding Officer of NOAA ship Ferdinand Hassler. Now, Hassler is a unique ship in the NOAA fleet, but with technology, built with new technology and new ideas. First of all, she's a swath vessel, which stands for Small Waterplane Area Twin Hull. A swath is a catamaran, but unlike most cats, which have V-shaped hulls, a swath has large cylinder-shaped tubes below the waterline on each hull. And we really should have a picture here that would make this easier to understand. But you can imagine the ship is almost like a platform perched on top of two submarines. The advantage of this is that the swath is much more stable and has better seakeeping capabilities than a monohull of similar size. But this doesn't come for free, and there are lots of other trade-offs of a swath design that I won't go into. But one other advantage is that not only is the ship able to operate in higher seas, but the twin hull design allows you to mount not one, but two multi-beam echo sounders, one on each hull, which leads to a wider swath of soundings and decreases the time needed to survey an assigned area. But with double the sonars comes double the requirement for data storage, double the processing power, and the requirement for efficient and processing and visualization tools. And while I was on Hassler, we also performed the first operational trials of a large autonomous underwater vehicle for production hydrography. So once again, going back to my grad school roots. And another interesting feature of the Hassler is that she has a tiny crew compared to other vessels in the NOAA fleet. And to compensate, she was designed and built with much more automation and electronics, including an electronic chart display and information system capable of using what were then NOAA's new electronic navigational charts. And this was really my first exposure to a non-paper chart environment, and my first exposure to how the bridge of the future and navigation products of the future would interact. Using the ECDIS and other electronic systems on a ship with a small crew really made me think about how we could better organize and present navigation information to enable safe and efficient operations on the bridges of ships with reduced staffing. So after Hassler, I went back ashore to be the chief of the Pacific Hydrographic Branch in Seattle and was thrust back into the survey workflow. PHB was responsible for reviewing all hydrographic data from the West Coast, Alaska, and the Pacific, and beginning the process of compiling that data for application to our charts. This was about 10 years ago. It's hard to believe. And at that time, we were still printing and manually reviewing sounding selection and features that would be applied to the chart. And we were really good at this, and we enjoyed it. However, at the same time, we were developing an automated process to produce a high-resolution bathymetric overlay for the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. This system ingested new survey data from the Army Corps of Engineers or other trusted sources and automatically produced and distributed a high-resolution product to augment the official chart. Now, this was the first trial of a concept we now call precision marine navigation, or PMN. PMN is the cornerstone of Coast Survey's next-generation products and services, built on a new family of international standards. It brings together critical navigation data such as high-resolution bathymetry, water levels, surface currents, weather forecasts, and other data streams into a single operational picture for the mariner displayed on the ECDIS. And this allows mariners to increase efficiency in our congested harbors optimize routing while offshore, and operate with smaller bridge crews, such as what I experienced on the Hassler. For example, the high-resolution bathymetric overlays of the port of LA Long Beach that I mentioned were critical to the marine pilots and operators of deep draft ships transiting that port, where every inch of additional draft that a ship can carry means additional cargo and reduced congestion. Because of our data, combined with high-resolution models of swells and the ship's performance, the Coast Guard was able to increase the maximum draft allowed for ultra-large crude carriers entering the port of Long Beach from 65 to 69 feet. And each additional foot of draft allows those ships to carry about 40,000 additional barrels of crude oil, and also reduces the need for lightering, which is the risky process of transferring cargo from a deeply laden large ship offshore to smaller ships to bring the product into the port. Overall, these improvements are estimated to have saved shippers about $10 million a year. And the Long Beach case study demonstrated the benefits of integrating NOAA's data sets and provided the catalyst for more widespread implementation of precision marine navigation elsewhere in the country. But back at PHB, there was tension between our manual methods to support the traditional paper chart workflow, at the same time that we were standing up this automated workflow that could quickly produce and maintain a high-resolution bathymetric data set for a region. And this tension set the stage for our current withdrawal from paper charts that I mentioned earlier in this talk. Now, for my last ship assignment, I returned to the NOAA ship Rainier, this time as commanding officer. And during my time as CO, we performed a wide range of projects from Alaska to California to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands and beyond. But one project I want to highlight is the work we did in collaboration with the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries in the Channel Islands off of Southern California. I mentioned previously that multi-beam sonars not only allow us to produce high-resolution 3D models of the seabed, but can also use sonar data to infer the composition of that seabed. This type of sonar data is called backscatter, and you can think of it as the loudness of the sound returned from the seafloor. Materials like rock reflect sound strongly and produce a loud return. Materials like mud absorb more of the sound, producing much weaker returns. And by collecting this information along with the depth data, we can build maps of backscatter intensities, which can be used to estimate the seafloor composition. Now, this information is really powerful. Previously, we took manual samples of the seafloor, primarily to help mariners identify areas that could be good anchorages. But if you could have seafloor composition information for an entire survey area, imagine what that would mean for scientists and resource managers interested in seafloor habitat. However, at the time I took command of Rainier, our multi-beam sonar systems required manual tuning, and they could be set up to collect good bathymetry or good backscatter, but they could not do both at the same time. Unfortunately, we had the opportunity to perform a complete upgrade to the next generation of multi-beam echo sounders that were finally capable of collecting both bathymetry and backscatter. We not only had to change the sonars, but we had to change our operational techniques and the way we ran the ships and launches to ensure that we were collecting both data streams of good quality. But as a result of this new capability, the projects assigned to Rainier were no longer focused solely on collecting bathymetry for charts. I mentioned the Channel Islands project, and this is a prime example of this. We were working in close collaboration with colleagues from sanctuaries and the backscatter mapping experts in the NOAA Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. We worked over several years with our sister ship Fairweather to resurvey the sanctuary waters. This data was used to support safe navigation and updated the nautical charts, but the main purpose was to generate backscatter imagery and habitat maps. This project is now complete and was one of the first large-scale demonstrations of the value hydrography could provide to NOAA's stewardship missions, in addition to ensuring safe, efficient navigation. So after Rainier, I returned to Silver Spring, was given the opportunity to work in the NOS front office. And though I didn't know it at the time, this proved to be critical preparation for being reassigned to the Director of Coast Survey as the Director of Coast Survey in December of 2021. So hopefully the stories I've shared here demonstrate how Coast Survey has been evolving over the course of my career from a product-focused organization focused on nautical charts to one focused on the full value of our data. Certainly for navigation first, but a wide range of other uses as well. When I came into the position of director, it was clear the Coast Survey was a lot closer to this goal than we had been at the beginning of my career, but we weren't there yet. This has been a long process with a long line of predecessors focused on making this transition. And I'm going to pause there for a second and wave my arms around to make the lights come back onto my office. But it really, this transition remains central to what we're trying to do here now. And we're almost there. We're really on the cusp of achieving the chart of the future through precision marine navigation. And the example shown here on this slide is from a presentation by Dr. Larry Mayer at the University of New Hampshire that I saw early in my career. And what it shows is the integration of high resolution bathymetry modulated by real-time water levels and then overlaid by surface currents. And at the time, 15 or 20 years ago, when I saw this the first time, this was a pipe dream. But we're now on the cusp, as I said, of producing this on an operational basis. So how are we doing this? Well, we've just published a new strategic plan, which I encourage you all to find on our website and read, which sets our course for balancing and completing this transition. It's tied to the NOAA strategic plan, in particular NOAA's goals to accelerate growth in the new blue economy and ensure a climate-ready nation. The nation's needs for navigation products and services are no less pressing today than they were 25 years ago or 216 years ago. Today, 70% of U.S. trade travels by water. And in 2020, waterborne shipping carried 1.5 trillion worth of goods in the U.S. However, as I've laid out earlier in this talk, there are broad requirements for these data for coastal resilience, stewardship, living marine resource management, offshore energy, and other applications. None of these other NOAA missions are possible without good maps of the seafloor. And we've structured our strategic plan and Coast Survey to be responsive to these demands by placing an even greater focus on expanding our ability to acquire and deliver high-value ocean and coastal geospatial data in the format that people need in a timely fashion. So what will this look like in practice? We've had a couple recent examples of projects that I think will demonstrate the direction our work can take in Coast Survey. The first is one recent example from just a few months ago in the port of Corpus Christi, Texas, which is expanding its shipping channel. Now, billions of dollars have been invested in dredging and shoreside infrastructure to accommodate this expansion. And as the project nears completion in its final phases, this will allow the port to have an additional 4 feet of an additional 4 feet of underkeel clearance. The maximum draft could increase from 43 feet to 47 feet. Now, the modernization of our data flow and focus on electronic nautical charts has allowed Coast Survey cartographers to rapidly update the charts after these massive dredging projects were completed. And as a result, earlier this year, only a few weeks after we received the updated survey data, the charts were up to date. And on July 21st, the first crude carrier sailed with a draft of 47 feet, meaning an additional 50,000 barrels of oil worth nearly $4 million and reduced congestion and increased safety in the port. This is a great example of how a small investment in geospatial infrastructure allows the full return on a massive investment in physical infrastructure. Another example of things we're doing in Coast Survey are the projects we have funded under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And under BIL, Coast Survey was funded to conduct hydrographic surveys of several East Coast estuaries. Now, these data will certainly be used to update the nautical charts, but again, this is an example of our data being primarily useful for other purposes. In this case, the primary driver is the requirement for high-resolution, shallow water bathymetry to support updated coastal hydrodynamic models. These models will improve our ability to forecast coastal flooding due to high tides and storm surge, as well as river flooding upstream. And you have to understand that the saltwater in the estuary is like a wall, which can cause freshwater in the river to back up. So understanding the estuary helps the Weather Service predict what's going to happen many miles inland. Now, the example shown here is from the Potomac River here in Maryland. And it was completed through the combined efforts of Coast Survey's survey vessel Bay Hydrographer and our small uncrewed systems surveying the very shallow, hard to reach areas, and the NOAA ship Thomas Jefferson and her survey launches in the deeper waters. And we've got several projects like this going on in the Chesapeake and in Albemarle Sound in North Carolina, where similar work is being completed by contractors. This new bathymetry will be used by the marine modeling team in our Coast Survey Development Laboratory in collaboration with the Weather Service to improve our ability to forecast flooding and safeguard coastal communities. So I've showed just two quick examples there, but clearly we aren't doing this alone. Coast Survey also works with other agencies and international hydrographic offices to achieve our shared goals. Now, a few of our partners in interagency forums are shown on this slide. First, I'll highlight the Committee on the Marine Transportation System, and this is a cabinet-level partnership of federal departments and agencies with responsibility for the marine transportation system. And it's of particular note this year because the rotating chair of that body has rotated to NOAA. And so my boss, Nicole LeBoeuf in the National Ocean Service, is now serving as the chair of the CMTS for the next year. Now, I've already mentioned our Integrated Ocean and Coastal Mapping Program, which is focused on planning, acquiring, integrating, and sharing ocean and coastal data so that we can map once and use many times. Another interagency forum is the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization Council, which is an interagency body which works to develop and implement multidisciplinary, collaborative, and coordinated approaches to this mapping, exploration, and characterization in the U.S. territorial waters and EEZ. And I'm proud to serve as one of three co-chairs of that committee, of that council rather, along with my friend Jeremy Wyrick in the Office of Ocean Exploration. I already mentioned the Joint Hydrographic Center, but I do want to also talk about COMET, which is the Center for Ocean Mapping and Innovative Technologies. This is our newest academic research center at the University of South Florida. They're working on mapping tools and techniques, primarily those optimized for shallow water. We also work closely with the agencies and partners shown on the right, including the Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers, Navy, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and other partners. We incorporate federally maintained channel data from the Army Corps into our charts. The Coast Guard provides and maintains aids to navigation, such as buoys and lighthouses, which we show on our charts. And we work closely with our Defense Department colleagues from NGA and from the Navy, as well as the State Department in the international field, representing the United States on the international stage. So as I mentioned previously, Coast Survey has a primarily domestic mission with responsibility for U.S. territorial waters and the EEZ. But everything we do is based on international standards. So we work closely with our partners in other nations to develop those standards, encourage data sharing, and ensure coordinated, seamless coverage of navigation data worldwide. We do this work through the International Hydrographic Organization and its technical committees. We also participate in regional hydrographic commissions that focus on the specific needs and challenges of particular areas. And I should mention that I've just recently returned from the Arctic Regional Hydrographic Commission meeting, which was hosted by Denmark in Nuuk, Greenland, just last week. And this part of the world is seeing the most rapid impacts of climate change, and understanding this science requires good maps. But we're also seeing increased maritime traffic in some of the most poorly surveyed and charted areas of the world. You may have seen the news just yesterday of a cruise ship that ran aground in far northern Greenland, with the nearest help is days away. So these issues are very timely and pressing. One of the major IHO initiatives that we've taken part in is the Empowering Women in Hydrography project. And this is a global effort led by the IHO and Canada that seeks to enable more women to participate equitably in the field of hydrography and assume leadership roles in the hydrographic community. As part of this, and as our contribution, NOAA has hosted 3 international female hydrographers in the NOAA fleet in each of the last 2 years, and will do so again in 2024. This project has been very well received and will be promoted from a project to a permanent program at the IHO this year. One of the other major IHO initiatives is the introduction and development and then introduction of the S100 framework. And these are the specifications for that next generation of electronic navigation products and services that I mentioned. And this is what enables our Precision Marine Navigation Initiative. I won't go into detail on those standards here, but I will mention that S101, which is the basic standard for that governs basic nautical charts, that goes into effect in 2026, which is coming very soon. This will be a major transformation from our current electronic chart standard to the new S101 standard. So we definitely have our work cut out for us. It never slows down. So how are we going to get this done? And I've talked a lot about our interesting technical work, but none of this is possible without our passionate and dedicated workforce. Our people are the essential ingredient in the success of our program, and they're critical for the future plans I've shared today. This is why workforce development is highlighted in our strategic plan. And a recent investment that I'd like to talk about that's very exciting is the recently established Center of Excellence for Operational Ocean and Great Lakes Mapping. This new center will complement the research at the Joint Hydrographic Center and the Center for Ocean Mapping and Innovative Technologies with a more operational focus. The new center will serve as NOAA's focal point for research to operations, transitioning new concepts and systems from research to operations, providing technical support for our mapping and surveying operations, and perhaps most pressing, developing and diversifying our mapping workforce. And we'll do all of this in collaboration with our public, academic, and private sector partners. This is all work. None of this is new. This is all work that we've been doing with limited resources for my entire career. So it's really exciting to be standing up a dedicated center to work on these problems for all of NOAA and across the mapping enterprise. So in closing, I hope I've convinced you that it's an exciting time in Coast Survey. Our work matters, it's in high demand, and while we've got plenty of challenges, we are closing in on our long-standing goal of focusing on our data as a critical asset and capability for the nation to support safe navigation and much more. So it's been a real pleasure to share that story with you today, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Admiral. Very informative. We have a number of questions.
Great.
What connection do you have with the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, the OMAO NOAA Line Office?
Yeah, well, in addition to being a NOAA Corps officer, and OMAO administers the NOAA Commissioned Corps, and I'm one of 3 flag officers in the NOAA Corps, so I have responsibility for helping to lead our service. Our program is absolutely, we are absolutely dependent on the services provided by the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, not just for NOAA Corps officers, but for the services of the NOAA fleet, which provide about half of our data, for the services they provide in governance and standards for small boat operations, which include our navigation response teams, and for the recently established NOAA Uncrewed Systems Operations Center, which is supporting much of our work to acquire data with uncrewed systems as part of our toolbox. So I could go into more detail there, but OMAO is an essential partner, and we work very, very closely with them.
Great, thank you. How much of the Coast Survey mission is executed by NOAA officers compared, say, to civilians? And what are the officers' primary role in the execution of the missions?
Right. So I think there's maybe a couple of questions there that I'll try to unpack a little bit. So within NOAA operations, well, let me back up a step and say that for our survey operations, we perform about half of our work with the NOAA in-house fleet, and that's the NOAA ships and contractors, or I'm sorry, NOAA ships and our navigation response teams. And the other half of our work is performed by private sector contractors, which are also civilians. So within the portion of our work that's performed in-house, NOAA commissioned officers have a dual responsibility. And this is really, I think, one of those focus areas where the technical expertise and operational expertise of the NOAA Corps, combined with the fact that we're adaptable and bring leadership capabilities, really brings a benefit to the mission. So in the NOAA fleet, as many folks know, the deck officers are NOAA commissioned officers, and the engineering officers and other personnel on the ship are civilian federal employees. On the hydrographic survey ships, one distinction is that the commanding officer also serves as chief of party, meaning that he or she is the chief scientist of the ship. And this goes back to the long history of the NOAA Commissioned Corps and its service within the hydrographic surveying mission of NOAA. And so the junior officers on the NOAA ships that perform hydrography work very closely with the survey technicians and really build that technical expertise to go along with their operational expertise in hydrography, and then bring that expertise ashore, serving in positions here in Coast Survey and elsewhere in the agency where hydrographic expertise is important. We have folks who are trained on the hydrographic survey ships working in billets in the fisheries service, in the sanctuaries office, and elsewhere around NOAA, again, where that expertise is required. So it's very complementary to the civilian workforce. The commissioned officers are part of the process by which we share that expertise around the agency and then build toward being in a position to take leadership responsibilities on the ships, as well as leadership responsibility here in the office of Coast Survey.
Thank you so much. There is no doubt that the office that you lead provide tremendous value, but are there estimates of the annual return on investment or value chain to the blue economy, let's say, by NOAA's Office of Coast Survey?
There are, and I should have this number on the tip of my tongue. 4 billion a year ish. Okay. Yeah. We recently did a study. My assistant is cueing me here. That we did a study recently that looked at the value of the nautical chart. And the exact numbers and the citation is in our strategic plan, and I should have those numbers committed to memory. But basically, it comes the value of the nautical charting program to the U.S. economy is on the order of about $4 billion a year, which is really huge. And that just looks at the value of our nautical charting program. It doesn't look at the other value provided by the high resolution data that we collect.
Thank you so much. Are there plans to adjust NOAA's hydrographic survey platforms, say ships, boats, and so on and so forth, to meet the increased demand for survey products beyond nautical charting?
That's a good question. And I think we've been slowly adapting to that. I mentioned the Channel Islands project that I was part of in California when I was CEO of Rainier. And I wouldn't say that we need to change the vessels, the platforms dramatically, but the way that we operate those, it needed to change to support the broader stream, backscatter, and the other data streams that support a wider range of NOAA missions. For instance, and I'll just give a couple examples here. For instance, when you're collecting bathymetry, you can generally turn the survey vessel rapidly around rocks, around land features. But when you're collecting backscatter data, those rapid turns have a tendency to corrupt the imagery and make it unusable. And so we had to change the way in which we operated the boats to ensure that we were collecting the data in a way that not only supported good bathymetry, which we were used to, but also supported good backscatter, which was really the point of that survey. So some operational changes to the platforms we already had, and I'll also mention the example I gave of the flood inundation modeling work that's currently going on in our estuaries on the East Coast. That requires us to survey in very shallow water. We need to understand the entire shape of the estuary, of the basin, to really understand where the water is going to go and how it will interact with freshwater coming downstream. Now, for the last 30 years or so, our navigation surveys have focused primarily on water that's about in deeper than 3 to 4 meters. And we really haven't done much work, except where it was absolutely required. We really haven't done much work in the very shallow waters because that's not where people are navigating with our charts. However, if we want to understand the shape of the basin for modeling purposes, that last 4 meters of depth is really critical. And that could cover many, 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 in the case of the Chesapeake, which is very shallow, that's a lot of surface area that would go unsurveyed if we applied our standard techniques to that. Now, surveying in shallow water is very laborious. I mentioned our multi-beam echo sounders that cover a swath of the seafloor. Well, that swath is across a fixed angle. And so in shallow water, the actual surface that you cover is much less than in deeper water where that swath widens out. So that's one of the reasons why we typically have focused our efforts on deep water, because we can get more bang for the survey buck. But if we really need that shallow water area, as we do for modeling, we need a different approach. And so we've looked at airborne techniques such as LIDAR, but we're also increasingly using small uncrewed systems. And I think there was a picture of one earlier in the presentation. Very small uncrewed systems which can operate efficiently. They're very shallow draft. They're equipped with exactly the same equipment as our larger survey vessels, but because they're shallow draft, because they can operate, they can maneuver easily in those shallow waters, they can in many cases acquire that shallow water data much more easily. So I guess I would say, to answer the question, I would say yes, we're adapting, we're changing to meet those new demands, but I wouldn't say we're making a wholesale change in the way that we do things. I'll also mention that we're very excited. I didn't have space in the presentation to work it in, but I'm very excited to share that we have 2 new large survey vessels coming. OMAO was able to award a contract this year for 2 new large survey ships that will replace Rainier and Fairweather, which are our West Coast survey ships. Those ships are 56 years old. And the new ships, which will come online in 5 years or so, will replace those. And those ships are being designed and built from the keel up to accommodate a mix, an adaptable, flexible mix of crewed and uncrewed systems. So going forward for the next 30, 40 years, for the life of those ships, we'll have much better ability to adapt the survey platforms that we're using to the requirements of the survey and the requirements of the data.
Thank you so much. Here's a more general question. How far are we from realizing an open access digital representation of the bathymetry of the coast and, say, open ocean areas?
Yeah, well, so I'll speak solely to our area of responsibility, which is the U.S. Territorial Sea and EEZ. And I guess I'll start at the top and say that despite having been working on this problem for 216 years, right now, only about 50% of U.S. waters are mapped to what we would consider modern acceptable standards. Most of that area has been mapped to some standard, but certainly not with the modern multi-beam echo sounders that I described in my talk. So we got a long way to go. Of the data that we have collected, all of that data is available from NCEI, from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information in Boulder. But what is not everywhere available is a seamless, authoritative, and up-to-date model of the seafloor. And we have that in work. It's called the National Bathymetric Source. It will be publicly accessible through a portal called Blue Topo. And this is all up online. If you Google for it, you can find it. We have that work done for most of the East Coast, and I believe we will have the entire East and Gulf Coasts complete by the end of this calendar year. And then we'll be transitioning to work on the West Coast, Alaska, the Pacific, and the Great Lakes. So that's coming. It's still that complete authoritative and up-to-date seamless model of the seafloor. That's coming. It's a high priority. It's called out in our strategic plan, but this is one of those things that we're not quite there yet on.
Thank you. There are many, many questions. Here's another one. Is there a role for crowdsourcing, I guess, citizen science, having a small commercial and private vessels help?
There absolutely is. And this is another one of those areas where we are developing our workflow and pipeline probably nowhere near as fast as we would like. We work very closely with the International Hydrographic Organization on this. The IHO and NOAA actually host a data center for digital bathymetry, also in Boulder, also hosted at NCEI. And that is a repository for bathymetric data from all sources. And we are building workflows that allow us to scrape data from the DCDB, which includes crowdsourced bathymetry, and build that into our pipeline. This is a subject of active research at the University of New Hampshire. One of the NOAA Corps officers who is stationed at UNH now, working on their master's research, did their thesis on exactly this problem. So this is an active area of research. I think it's an area of huge promise, and we're working to build that into our workflow. At a minimum, we do currently use crowdsourced bathymetry as a reconnaissance tool, giving us an indication of where we might need to go survey with our own tools. What we really like to do is get to the point where we understand the uncertainty associated with crowdsourced bathymetry sufficiently that we can build it into our workflow and actually use it in our products and services.
Thank you. What skills or education do you need to work in charting and coastal survey? And I'm thinking more of the next generation coming on board.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the answer is broad. We need folks who are, come from backgrounds, perhaps similar to my own, with a more engineering background, focused on acoustics and science and mathematics associated with the work that we do in the field. We need folks with a geography and cartography background to actually produce products that users can use. But I think increasingly we also need people who understand the value of this data to other disciplines. And there's an adage here in Coast Survey that by and large, we bring people aboard for their attitude and for their outlook, and we can train them for skills. Now, some of that is hard science and hard mathematics that you have to get somewhere. And if you can get that as an undergrad, well, so much the better. But the on-ramp is open for many, many disciplines because the application of our data is so broad.
Thank you. Here's another question that, let's say, can you speak to the work of NOAA in doing or bridging the gap between, say, the paper chart and transition to ENCs, in particular in regards to your discussions with the Coast Guard?
Yeah, that almost sounds like a little bit of a loaded question, but I'm happy to take a stab at it. So yeah, absolutely. There is, and I don't want to go too far into too much detail here because we only have a few minutes, but at a high level, most large commercial ships have made the transition to electronic nautical charts. They're a requirement. ECDIS is a requirement for offshore international voyages. And so those large deep draft ships have already made that transition. And most of many recreational users kind of down at the bottom of the pyramid are also using electronic chart data. They may be using a paper product to augment the chart, but they're typically navigating based on a chart plotter or something on their computer or on their phone. It's that middle section of users that are in what we consider the light commercial sector. So this is towing vessels, this is fishing vessels, small dinner cruise boats, things of that nature, that are not required to carry ECDIS and are caught in this transition between electronic charts and between paper charts and electronic charts. And we're working very closely with the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard has responsibility for setting the requirements for nautical charts and for all navigation systems on the bridge of vessels operating in U.S. waters, including those light commercial craft that I mentioned. Right now, Coast Guard is in the process of updating their rules associated with that. They have issued some rules which allow the use of electronic nautical charts and what we call electronic chart systems, which are not ECDISs, but perform in many respects similar to an ECDIS, and they can display and utilize ENCs. The Coast Guard has regulations in place that allow for this. They're in the process of updating those regulations, and we're working very closely to ensure that as we cancel the paper charts and improve the functionality of our ENCs, that the Coast Guard is right there with us. I'll also talk about our custom chart tool. And what that is a means for users to build and print their own paper chart products derived from our ENC data. And these, as I mentioned, many users want to have a paper product. When I go out as a recreational sailor, I want to have a paper chart product to serve situational awareness, to give me the big picture of what's going on in the area that I'm sailing in addition to having that real-time navigation provided by a chart plotter or an ECS or an ECDIS. And the NOAA custom chart provides that functionality. It allows users to print paper products of their own that meet their own uses. Now, what those are not, they are not official nautical charts. Because we have no control of how users print them. Do they print them at the right scale? Do they print them? Do they have the right inkjet or ink in their printer? Are they really fit for purpose? Because it's customized, we don't have direct control over that and can't say that, yes, this is a nautical chart. Once again. But they can be valuable products. That functionality is up online. It's operational now, and we're making rapid improvements to that as we go.
Okay, well, one last question.
Sure.
Is NOAA concerned with how climate change and weather, extreme weather may affect, our ocean shipping and things of that nature?
Absolutely. I think, closest to home, right? You only have to look at the increase in severe weather from hurricanes and other severe weather to see the impact that could have on our ports, on our waterways. Thinking about the way that our ports are structured, we have highly concentrated ports, the disruptions to which can be devastating to the U.S. economy and to our supply chain. We saw that not because of extreme weather, but because of other factors in LA Long Beach a couple of years ago. So our marine transportation system needs to be more resilient to impacts of climate change, such as severe weather. I'll also note that that hydrography and ocean mapping has a critical role to play in understanding climate change. So much of the climate is driven by world ocean circulation patterns. You can't understand those circulation patterns if you don't have a good understanding and high resolution models of the seabed, because that's what guides the flow of those waters around the world's oceans and in our coastal zones as well. So we definitely see this as a multifaceted challenge for us in Coast Survey, not only to meet the needs of our marine transportation system, but to provide the data which will enable a better understanding of climate and climate change worldwide.
Well, with that, I want to thank Admiral Evans again for speaking with us today. Very informative. I learned a ton myself. Thank you to all that support that make this NELS seminars possible, and also to the online audience today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to share the story.
Thanks.